Ladies and gentlemen, there is a truth, ancient and often forgotten, that before the soul ascends, it must first descend. Before light can be fully known, the shadow must be encountered. And often, the cradle of that descent is the family, not always loving or supportive, but often fractured, confused, or toxic. One does not awaken on mountain tops. Awakening begins in the valleys, in the tangled roots of pain, misunderstanding, and sorrow. It is in these very places that the strongest souls are forged, not in ease but in conflict, not in harmony but in dissonance. Let us look more deeply at this paradox. The family is the first mirror in which the psyche catches its earliest reflection, the crucible where the individual begins the long and often painful process of discovering who and what they are. It is here that the seeds of identity are sown, watered by love or neglect, by affirmation or rejection. In a healthy family, the mirror offers clarity. A child sees themselves reflected in the eyes of caregivers with warmth, understanding, and attunement. But in a toxic family, that mirror is cracked. The image returned is warped, misaligned, sometimes terrifying. The child who looks into this mirror cannot trust what they see. They begin to internalize the distortions as truth. They learn, not through words but through tone, silence, and atmosphere, that their feelings are too much, their needs are inconvenient, their very existence is burdensome. This becomes the soil in which their earliest sense of self is formed, and yet, paradoxically, it is precisely this distortion that forces the soul to look inward. When the outer world offers no stable ground, when love is inconsistent, and the air is thick with unspoken tension, the child often unconsciously begins to seek stability within. This inward gaze is not yet a conscious spiritual practice, but it is the beginning of self-awareness. The child begins to watch, to intuit, to feel the hidden undercurrents beneath the words spoken at the dinner table, to sense the repressed rage behind the parental smile. This sensitivity, born in survival, slowly becomes the foundation for a deeper psychological and spiritual perceptiveness later in life. The toxic family does not offer the luxury of a passive existence. In such a home, one cannot simply be. One must constantly adapt, anticipate, minimize, disappear. The child, in response, develops an exquisite sensitivity to energy, to moods, to nuance. What begins as hypervigilance becomes, in time, the gift of intuition. What starts as fear of conflict becomes a finely tuned radar for authenticity. The soul, forced to navigate this treacherous terrain, becomes a silent observer, not out of wisdom at first, but out of necessity. And it is this observation, this early split between outer experience and inner truth, that gives birth to a profound inner life here. The psyche begins to differentiate itself from the false narratives imposed upon it. They say I am too emotional, but I feel deeply. Is that wrong? They shame my silence, but in silence I hear things they cannot. They call me difficult, but maybe I am just unwilling to lie. These inner whispers are the soul's quiet rebellion, the first steps in reclaiming a lost self. Over time, this growing dissonance between outer identity and inner truth becomes unbearable. A crisis of being emerges, not one of despair alone, but of potential. The cracks in the mirror begin to serve a new purpose. They allow light to enter, and that light, though faint at first, begins to guide the soul forward. It illuminates the ancestral patterns playing out in the home, the generational wounds passed down like heirlooms. It reveals that the parents, too, are caught in a web of their own unresolved trauma. The child, now growing into a seeker, begins to ask deeper questions, not just why am I like this, but why are they like this? Where does this cycle begin? And can it end with me? This turning point, subtle yet seismic, marks the beginning of individuation, the sacred process by which the self differentiates from the collective, from the inherited, From the false, what began as pain now becomes path. What felt like punishment reveals itself as purpose. The cracked mirror no longer defines the self, it becomes the symbol of what was overcome. The soul that emerged from such a family did not merely survive, it witnessed, it learned, it remembered something the world often forgets. That truth, though buried beneath dysfunction, can still be found. That identity, though shaped in distortion, can be reformed in clarity. That within the most broken reflections, one might discover the outline of something unbreakable. There are truths that reside so deeply in the soul, they can only be unearthed by pain. Suffering, though dreaded and misunderstood, is not simply a condition to be escaped, but an initiation into deeper consciousness. It is the crack through which the unconscious speaks, the flame that burns away illusion, the storm that washes away inherited masks. In the context of a toxic family, suffering is rarely subtle. It arrives early and without warning, seeping into the emotional fabric of the child's reality. The atmosphere is thick with contradiction, words that deny what the heart knows, affection given with conditions, love offered as a reward for obedience rather than as a birthright. This is not the suffering of fate alone, but of being unseen, unheard, unvalidated in one's authentic self. And yet, paradoxically, it is this very pain that sharpens the soul's edge, carving out a space for awareness that would otherwise remain dormant. The ego, in its earliest form, is fragile and porous, easily molded by the opinions and projections of those closest. In toxic families, this ego is wounded before it has a chance to solidify. The child learns to doubt their own perceptions. They learn that anger is dangerous, that sadness must be hidden, that joy must be regulated to match the mood of the room. But what does not disappear is the inner witness, the part of the psyche that sees, that remembers, that endures. While the outer personality fractures in order to survive, the core of the self retreats inward, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. And this waiting is not passive. It is a quiet, growing flame, a secret knowing that there is more to life than this pain, more to the self than this role. Suffering, then, becomes the alchemical heat that begins to awaken this deeper self. This inner fire does not need permission to burn. It grows beneath the surface, often unnoticed even by the one who carries it. It is not taught by words or inherited through tradition. It arises in response to despair. In the darkest hours, when the child is left alone with overwhelming emotion, when the family cannot or will not offer safety or repair, the psyche begins to construct its own inner sanctuary. Here, the self starts to speak to itself. A dialogue is born between the broken and the whole, between the pain and the wisdom it conceals. And in this dialogue, the soul begins to emerge not in resistance to the trauma, but in response to it. The pain is not the soul's enemy, it is its messenger. This is the moment when suffering transforms. It ceases to be chaos and begins to offer direction. The individual begins to perceive meaning within the wounds, not as justification for the abuse, but as evidence of an unfolding process. The patterns of trauma start to reveal a hidden architecture, a structure within the suffering that points toward awakening. What once felt random or cruel begins to feel strangely familiar, as though part of a deeper calling. The pain becomes a threshold, and standing at this threshold, the soul must choose to turn away and numb, or to move forward into the unknown and reclaim what has been lost. Most turn away at first. The call of transformation is frightening. It demands the death of false identities, of beliefs built on fear, of loyalty to dysfunction. But for the strong soul, eventually, something deeper prevails. The pain becomes too loud to ignore, too potent to be dismissed, and so the descent begins not into madness, but into truth, into the layers of the unconscious that have been waiting to be seen. into the ancestral grief that has never been named, into the buried parts of the self that were exiled in childhood, not because they were wrong, but because they were too true for the environment that rejected them. This descent is the beginning of real power. Not the power of domination or control, but of clarity, of wholeness, of spiritual authority. The very suffering that once seemed to threaten the self now becomes the crucible in which the self is forged. And through this process, the soul discovers not only who it is, but who it has always been. Beneath the pain, the shadow is the part of the psyche most often feared, rejected, or denied. Yet it is also the doorway through which the light of transformation must pass. In the context of a toxic family, the shadow is not only hidden within the self, but also projected outward with force and consistency. The child becomes the bearer of what the parents cannot face within themselves. They are labeled as difficult, dramatic, sensitive, rebellious, or selfish, not because they inherently possess these qualities in excess, but because they reflect back to the family the parts that have been buried and disowned. This unconscious mechanism of projection serves to protect the fragile egos of the adults, but it places a heavy psychological burden on the child who is made to carry emotional material that does not belong to them. The child absorbs these projections not as foreign energies, but as truths about their identity. Over time, they internalize the belief that they are the source of the dysfunction, the origin of the chaos, the flaw in the system. But this painful internalization is also what begins to deepen their insight, as it requires them to question reality at a level most never have to. As the soul matures, it begins to recognize the pattern. It starts to distinguish between what is truly its own and what was imposed. The narratives that once governed self-worth begin to crack under scrutiny. The shame that clung to the bones like a second skin begins to dissolve in the light of awareness. But this process is not gentle. It requires the individual to descend into the very places within that they were trained to avoid. The rage they were told to suppress, the sadness they were taught to ignore, the joy they were punished for expressing, all must be reclaimed from the unconscious. The shadow, which once seemed like a threat to the persona, reveals itself as the missing half of the self. It contains not only the pain but the power, not only the wounds but the wisdom, not only the fear but the freedom that comes from facing it. The soul that is willing to turn toward the shadow does not weaken. It expands. In toxic families, children often become the emotional lightning rods for generations of denied feelings. They are punished not just for their own behavior, but for the unhealed histories of those who came before. They are asked, often silently, to carry the weight of secrets, betrayals, regrets, and regrets that have never been spoken aloud. Yet this burden, as brutal as it is, becomes the path through which they learn to see clearly. Because they have been forced to navigate the terrain of untruth, they develop a piercing sensitivity to authenticity. They come to sense when someone is hiding, when someone is lying to themselves, when someone is masking pain with performance. This perception, born from early exposure to the shadow, becomes their compass later in life. They begin to understand that what others fear in themselves is often what they project outward, and they learn that wholeness requires the integration of all aspects of the psyche, not just the polished, socially acceptable ones. The soul that integrates its shadow becomes sovereign. It no longer chases validation from those who could never truly see it. It no longer twists itself to fit into roles that were assigned without consent. It begins to move from a center that is grounded, knowing, and free. But this liberation does not occur without cost. It demands that the individual step away from inherited identities, from the collective trance of the family system, from the lies that were once accepted as love. It requires them to become deeply intimate with their own darkness, not to be consumed by it, but to understand it, to walk beside it, and to learn its language. For only in this intimacy with the shadow does one find the key to authenticity, to purpose, and to inner peace. The child who once bore the weight of the family's unspoken truths becomes the adult who speaks the truth, who lives it, who carries light not because they were untouched by darkness, but because they chose to confront it, embrace it, and become whole in its presence from the ashes of deep wounding arises a figure both ancient and archetypal, the one who suffers not only to heal, but to transform that suffering into a source of wisdom and restoration for others. This is the wounded healer, the one who did not choose their pain, yet chooses what to do with it. In the context of a toxic family, this emergence often begins in silence, in the private world of a child who feels everything more than they are supposed to, who senses that something is terribly wrong, but cannot speak it aloud without being punished, shamed, or dismissed. They learn early that love may come with conditions, that affection may be withdrawn as punishment, that honesty may trigger rage, and that safety is often an illusion. In response, they begin to develop not only a capacity for emotional survival, but a gift for understanding suffering in others. They notice what others miss. They begin to listen with more than their ears. They begin to see into people, to sense what they are not saying, to understand the language of pain without words. This attunement, born of trauma, is not merely a survival strategy, but the seed of an extraordinary capacity. The child, who must intuit danger before it arrives, who must track the emotional weather of the home in order to avoid eruption or withdrawal, becomes the adult who can enter the emotional reality of another without judgment or fear. They begin to recognize pain not as an enemy, but as a teacher. They see how others hide behind masks because they once wore masks too. They see how others avoid vulnerability because they themselves had to conceal their tenderness to protect it from ridicule or harm. And through this recognition, compassion begins to emerge, not the superficial kind that pities or rescues, but the deep kind that understands, that holds, that allows space for transformation without force. The wounded healer does not impose healing, they embody it. They become the presence in which others begin to remember their own wholeness, because the healer has done the same for themselves. This journey, however, is not linear. It often involves years of self-doubt, of trying to become what others expect, of contorting into shapes that please or pacify. The wounded healer is often a late bloomer, for they must first dismantle the false self that was built to survive. This dismantling can look like failure, breakdown, disorientation. It can feel like falling apart, but what is truly happening is the falling away of everything that was never truly theirs. They must descend into the origins of their wounds, face the parts of themselves that were silenced, and confront the family myths that kept them bound. In doing so, they come to a profound realization that their value is not based on being useful, agreeable, or successful according to the distorted standards they were raised with. Their value lies in their ability to feel, to know, to witness, to hold the tension between what is broken and what is possible as they heal. They begin to recognize their sensitivity as strength, their empathy as intelligence, their pain as sacred. They begin to forgive themselves for how they coped, for the walls they built, for the times they abandoned themselves in order to be accepted. And in this self-forgiveness, something ancient and powerful awakens. The healer does not merely carry knowledge, they carry presence. They have touched their own darkness and survived. They have seen the worst and still chosen to love. They have walked through fire and emerged not unburned but purified. And this presence becomes medicine for those still lost in the fire, for those who have not yet found a way out, for those who cannot yet see that their pain is not a sign of weakness, but the birthplace of their future strength. The world is full of teachings about how to avoid suffering, but Wounded healer knows the deeper truth that it is only by moving through the pain with courage, honesty, and tenderness that one becomes whole. The toxic family, in all its dysfunction, becomes the sacred forge in which this alchemy begins. Not because the pain is noble, but because the soul is. The wound, once seen as the place of brokenness, becomes the place where the light enters, and the one who once cried out for someone to understand now becomes the one who can sit in silence with another's grief and say, without words, "I know there comes a moment in the life of the strong soul when the chaos of the past no longer defines the shape of the future, when the inherited scripts of dysfunction begin to unravel, and the individual stands at the threshold of something entirely different. This is not merely a turning away from what was, but a profound turning toward what can be." The soul, once bound by the invisible chains of generational pain, begins to realize that its existence is not confined to the repetition of ancestral wounds. It starts to sense that it was born not to perpetuate cycles, but to end them, and not with violence or rebellion, but through the quiet and radical act of choosing a new way of being. This choice is not made in grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but in small, sacred decisions to tell the truth even when it shakes the voice, to feel emotions instead of numbing them, to sit in discomfort rather than seek distraction, to stay with oneself even when the world feels unbearable. The strong soul does not emerge from toxic soil unscarred, but it emerges conscious. It knows the texture of silence that suffocates rather than soothes. It knows the difference between love and control, between loyalty and enmeshment, between connection and dependency. It has learned these lessons not from books or teachers, but from living within the fire of contradiction and choosing, again and again, to not let it define the spirit. This kind of soul develops a commitment to truth so profound that it becomes immune to the seduction of false belonging. It no longer yearns for approval from those who never saw its light clearly, nor does it shift to gain acceptance in rooms where authenticity is not welcome. The soul begins to choose alignment over attachment, peace over performance, integrity over illusion. And in doing so, it steps into its true authority not over others, but over itself. This is the birth of the sovereign self, the one who is no longer ruled by the ghosts of their upbringing, no longer pulled by the tides of old emotional patterns, no longer seduced by the idea that healing will come through fixing others or being fixed by them. The sovereign self knows that the family system may never acknowledge the harm it caused, that the apologies longed for may never come, that the redemption imagined in reconciliation may remain forever unmet. And yet, the soul heals anyway. It chooses to release the hope that the past could be different, and instead claims the power to live fully in the present. It becomes the one who interrupts the legacy of silence, the one who chooses softness where there was cruelty, the one who raises their voice not in anger alone, but in clarity, the one who creates a new lineage with every conscious choice they make. This kind of awakening is not loud, but it is seismic. It shakes the foundation of everything that once seemed permanent. It calls the individual back from exile, from the parts of themselves they had to hide, deny, or abandon to survive. It brings those parts back into the fold, not as weaknesses, but as sources of power. The sensitivity that once brought shame becomes the doorway to deep connection. The anger that once felt dangerous becomes the fuel for boundaries. The grief that once felt endless becomes the opening into compassion. The soul becomes whole not by erasing the past, but by integrating it, weaving it into a tapestry that tells a different story, one of resilience, of transformation, of reclamation, and with this wholeness comes a new kind of vision. The strong soul begins to see beyond personal healing and into the collective need for awakening. It understands that every time one person chooses to heal, to live truthfully, to love without fear, a ripple is sent through the human story. The wound is no longer a source of shame, but a map, guiding others out of the dark. The toxic family, once the site of pain, becomes the origin point of something far more powerful, a soul who has remembered who they are, and who now lives as a light in a world that has forgotten so. If you have found yourself born into darkness, do not despair. Your soul chose this, not for punishment, but for purpose, not to suffer endlessly, but to awaken deeply. The task is not to curse the roots, but to understand them, for from those roots the tallest trees may grow. From that ancestral soil, even if poisoned, a new bloom may emerge, conscious and free. There is no ascent without descent, no gold without the shadow, and no strong soul that has not first walked through fire. So, walk boldly, not away from your past, but into it. There you will find the fragments of your truth, waiting to be made whole. Thank you.